At the Sports Business Leaders Conference, Nate Nancer, the Blizzard Global Head of Esports, put up a slide when he was discussing the proposed Overwatch League, which is set to launch in the third quarter of this year, 2017. And on the slide, it was showing what the league might look like. And it showed 16 different cities, because remember, Blizzard wants to go with this geo-location approach where a team is somehow representative of an actual city in the world, not an imaginary one. And so there were 16 slots. And as an example of how it might work, the slide showed 11 slots for NA, 3 slots for EU, 2 slots for Asia. So 16 in total. Now, at the bottom of the slide, in the bottom right, it did say illustrative cities and locations. And the guy who revealed the slide was then told by Nate Nancer that it was just an illustration of what the Overwatch League could look like and was not a real image, in as much as it wasn't really the 16 teams and where the slots would be divided up and which exact cities necessary they would be. The problem is, despite the fact that we don't have the exact ones, it actually makes this a topical issue of where will the slots be and which cities will they be and what does it mean to have geolocation in that particular sense, and how will this affect which teams from Overwatch can be involved in the league and how the league will be structured. So I think this is a great time to have a discussion about the fact that there are obvious problems and issues raised by the idea of having slots in different regions and who will have slots and how slots will be divided and what the location means, that I think should be discussed, because I don't see any obvious solutions. And in fact, I think no matter which way you go, even if you went the approach that Thorin wants and went some super hardcore approach and had most of the league be Korean, that in itself doesn't take care of a lot of the issues of what people want from the Overwatch League. And so I think the concept of the Overwatch League has some key flaws in it, in as much as everyone who wants to be involved right now clearly can't be, and whoever's left out, it's going to leave a hole in the scene somehow. So let's look at what the proposed hypothetical was and consider that, because even though in theory these cities can change and the number of slots can change, actually the way this slide was laid out I think is fairly indicative of what the Overwatch League probably would end up being. Secondly, there's not long until the Overwatch League actually begins. I mean, we're not far away from coming into summer now and being in a position where it's going to be pretty close to the league having to launch, and therefore the people being locked in as to who's going to be in the league, then what city you're going to represent, etc. Also, you look at the breakdown of the different slots, and this is actually logical as to how it would break down in terms of who wants to be involved in Overwatch League, who's already shown interest, and where the money is. So at the moment, okay, the hypothetical had 11 North American slots. It had, like I said, 3 in Europe and 2 in Asia. And the Asian ones, for obvious reasons, 1 in China, Shanghai, 1 in Seoul, Korea. So this kind of a slot, and even the premise, if we consider what Overwatch League might look like, raises all kinds of questions. In fact, it raises tons and tons of questions and provides very little answers. And in fact, Blizzard has been entirely tight-lipped on any of these answers. They haven't even let us know what their philosophy is on how the league will be run, what concepts they're running on, how much they're involved with the different scenes around the world. And so they can't really blame anyone else for speculating. That is all people can do right now. I realize someone could say, well, no, you could just shut up and not say anything. Yeah, well, that would be great, wouldn't it? To just all sit here in complete silence and not think about anything or say anything. So that is a stupid perspective. Now, certainly we don't know anything, so we can only speculate. But to me, the fact that Blizzard reveals nothing, I actually think that they haven't figured it out themselves. And when I think about all the possible scenarios, I don't think there are any solutions that cover all bases and that fix everything for all the people who want to be involved and leave certain parties without disappointment. I think actually that's a problem, is that I don't think anyone could come to good solutions for some of this. You can come to the best solution in light of the circumstances, but that's an issue in itself. So first of all, what does it actually mean to have one of these cities, to have a representative city, whether it ends up being Boston or whether Boston isn't there and instead Oklahoma's there, for example? What does it actually mean to have one of those locations? Like, does that mean that if you're an outside investor who doesn't come from that area, you can bid, win that city? Now, what does that mean? Do you have to in any way move your team there now or in the future? Do you have to, if you don't move your team there, go there for certain local events and trying to raise awareness in that area? Do you have to go there at certain times during the year? If your sports franchise, for example, we're thinking of huge people trying to bid, if there's a sports franchise from that area, so let's say the Boston Celtics or the Boston Bruins. Let's say one of these wants to actually buy the Boston spot. If they offer the same amount of money as a big org that isn't from Boston, are they going to give them preferential treatment? Will they very likely win out the slot? Now, people might say, well, they should, Thorin. I mean, they already have a fan base and they know how to market that area. No. This is esports. We have no idea what they can do within esports. We have no idea that these big sports franchises have any clue how the modern day world works in terms of the internet and marketing to the people who follow esports teams. So it's not necessarily that should automatically happen. But will that happen? Is that how Blizzard's thinking? Again, they don't let on any of this information whatsoever to us. Then you've got to ask yourself, is the local approach, a representative aspect and city approach, even the right approach? I mean, it's not how esports has run for the last 15, 16 years or so. I mean, esports has been around longer than that, but we think of like the real business of esports. That is not in any way the model we've taken so far. We've absolutely not shown that cities can provide enough fans. Little interesting detail that no one brings up for you, okay? So Korea, South Korea, is one of the most successful esports places we've ever seen. This is a place that's had the massive non-endemic sponsors come in. Massive telecom companies, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, or Pringles. All these different people have come into to Korean esports at certain times in Brood War and League of Legends. And yet, when they have their big international, their big domestic league in StarCraft, in League of Legends, the weekly shows get 100 to 200 people sat in the audience. And they set up the camera so it looks like it's huge, but that's all they get. And for finals, some of the finals and some of the games that have been big have had thousands, 10,000. We've heard reports. The claim is that the biggest ever in like 2005 and 2006 was 120,000. I don't know that I believe it, and I'm not sure from the picture if we can see how much there is. But let's say they're having tens of thousands. Okay, that's for the big finals and the big games. Smaller games, StarCraft 2, there was a final, the one where Seed beat MC, where it seemed as though there was next to no one went to that final, even though they had it all booked out. So even in Korea, we haven't established that you can have big stadium events. And that's a city that has 10 million people there. That's a city that has a fifth of the population, where it's very, very interested in games like League of Legends, StarCraft 2. They haven't proven that they can do it. Now, in Shanghai, in LPL, we've seen that, yeah, they have been able to get pretty big audiences. Now, they do that with 1 billion people to choose from. They do that with a massive amount of people around the Shanghai area. They do that, I would guess, by perhaps it's cheap to enter. Again, we'd need someone from Chinese esports to help us figure that out. I don't know that Blizzard knows how that works. I don't know that the Western world knows how it works, because we're not taking cues from how they do it in Asia. Then you've got to add in the fact that if we're going to have this city-based approach and this local grassroots approach that's going to connect into these big orgs that have the slot, that is a massively far away long-term picture. That's looking at some huge picture that the rest of us didn't even know existed, because we live in this little square of the picture and you're thinking the picture is this big. Now, if that's the case, it's very ambitious. Perhaps it would be a multi-billion dollar, trillion dollar industry. All could be the case. Right now, we have no basis to say that that will actually work out. The model isn't working in other aspects of Western esports. We really don't know that that even can work. So the idea of going all in from day one, in any context in that sense, or signaling that that's where you're heading, is incredibly ambitious. And the problem with being incredibly ambitious is, if you do everything and you innovate everything and you almost create the bridge to get over to the other side where you want to be that doesn't exist as you're walking over it, yeah, you know what? You're a genius. You'll be hailed as much. We will say that you brought a new dawn to esports and you revolutionized the whole worldview and cracked the old paradigm. But you know what else? You could also be the biggest failure ever. You could also take millions of dollars and dump them into a black hole. You could also set the whole industry back 50 years, perhaps. I mean, I guess 50 years doesn't make sense in the context of what I mean right now. I mean, as in, it might take 40 more years before esports can ever get another shot like this at the big time. Or your esports game might just get sidetracked completely and people say they took totally the wrong approach. Let's stick with these other ones that are gradually building up. Or let's stick with this one that has a model that works now on a smaller scale, and let's see if it can ever get to another area, and therefore we'll invest more money in League of Legends, in CSGO, in other esports games, and perhaps not Overwatch, because Overwatch is obviously a big gamble in that sense. It hasn't gotten all the Western and all the Asian money into it in the way those other bigger esports games in terms of the esports side have. As a casual game, Overwatch is killing it. But can it translate that success? A lot of it's riding on the Overwatch League right now. Then you've got to add in that if we're going to have all these slots in the Overwatch League, and the Overwatch League are just going to be teams who presumably play against each other in the league, and perhaps the geolocations mean something at some point or initially, okay, is there international play? Does that mean that the teams who have the slots in Asia, however many they be in, wherever they may be, also compete in the Overwatch League itself. So is everyone going to be in a central location playing? This is a question, right? Is the Overwatch League going to be a circuit that goes from stop to stop to stop? And so we're in North America sometimes, we're in Europe sometimes, we're in Asia sometimes. Are we going to travel the world with the league? Or is it all going to take place in a studio in LA? Is that what it will be like instead? No word on that whatsoever. And yet, either way that goes, we can see a lot of logistic issues, getting visas. We can see the issues of having someone from China, someone from Korea, potentially living for the entire year in America. Might be issues right there. Will the teams even do it? Will Korean and Chinese teams want to do that? They tend to be very insular regions, actually, that want to compete there themselves, not least because, a little known fact for Westerners, China has something called ACE. Korea has something called KESPA. These are associations or unions of the teams and some of the big players, broadcasters, big companies within those markets. And that is the way that Asian business in general works. With these small amount of people, you could call them a cabal, a cartel, whatever you want to call them. That's the way they tend to operate. And that's why they want it insular. So they control all the variables. They pipeline the money into their scene and then they pipeline the money out to themselves. They don't necessarily want to take part in someone else's thing. They might take part every now and then if it's international competition. Will they cede control to Blizzard though, or make a partnership with Blizzard to somehow compete in this league and therefore send arguably their best team or their best org over into this Overwatch League when perhaps some of their other teams are going to be stuck just locked into their own country or competing in smaller domestic competitions and international competitions if there indeed are any during this point in time? This is another quite crucial question, right? Also, when we talk about having this international approach and this geolocation, if you can buy a slot, but you don't have to be from that city, you don't have to be connected with that city, you just have to make a good deal. Okay, what if I'm an NA org and I have a lot of money and I've got millions of dollars invested? Let's say the Oakland Raiders come and they decide that they want to invest in my org and they're going to give me millions and say, go out, buy us a slot. But you know what? Turns out Chicago's gone. San Francisco's gone. Hypothetically, if these were the cities. Let's say I can't actually get an NA slot. But you know what? I have more money to bid than the team that's from Shanghai or Seoul. Can I, as an NA org, buy a slot from Shanghai and Seoul? If I can, in one level, that's good because now all the people with a lot of money can still get involved even if they're not from that area. On another level, it's bad. Now, does that mean that Chinese orgs can't get involved unless they try and buy an American spot? Or does that, or a European spot if that ends up being the region that's worth the least money? Does that mean that Seoul might not have any Korean teams at all in terms of orgs buying the spots? Now then, once orgs have bought the spots, can orgs just buy any teams they want? Can every team in the league just buy a Korean team if they want and have, out of the 16 teams, can like 8 of them be Korean if Koreans really turn out to be the best? Does that mean that despite cities being represented and a circuit being represented, we'll have very weird skewed representation in terms of whether it's the best players, whether it's a truly global league? Should a certain amount of NA orgs and spots have NA players in them? Should a certain amount of European orgs have European EU players in them? Should a certain amount of Asian spots have Asian players in them? If not, okay, maybe if the Koreans are the best and they play in America and Americans like to have the best players and want to win, maybe a team from New York could have a Korean team and win. But can you have a team potentially one day of foreigners, non-Koreans, that play for the Seoul org in Korea, and can they actually be loved by the fans? Can you build out that basis that the geolocation implies without people from that area? Perhaps, I know in the Korean Baseball League they have foreign players if they're better than the Koreans at baseball, because in their world, in baseball, obviously non-Koreans, Americans are better. But if Koreans are better and we have players that are worse than the Koreans and the potentially Westerners, can that work? There's a lot of questions to be asked here, right? Then let's look at the different regions and go region by region and see the issues. So let's start in NA. So even though this is just illustrative and we could change these spots anyway, why are you giving us an illustrative slide if not to at least vaguely suggest that this is like along the lines you're thinking? Whether it's this specific city, that's one thing. Whether it's one more slot here, one less slot there. But in general, presumably, at least something about this is in line with how Blizzard thinking. Otherwise, it'd be very weird, put it this way, if in 6 months from now, they announce actually that it was nothing like that and there's only 2 slots in NA and actually there's 10 in Korea. That seems very unlikely, right? So actually, when I saw this breakdown seems in line with how Blizzard's been talking, the rumblings that we've been hearing, and the sorts of teams that would want to invest. So let's assume that we have anything like this, okay? So at the moment, they had fictionally 11 cities listed out of 16 as NA slots. So almost 70% of the Overwatch League, NA slots. Don't know if that means orgs or teams, just means slots. Now, In terms of NA teams, there's only really at the moment 3 that have the popularity and the fame to suggest that people would automatically say there should be an Overwatch League. So that's Cloud9, NRG, and FaZe. And by the way, of FaZe, the best player, Shadowburn, is actually Russian. He's EU. I mean, not technically EU, I guess. European, if what we mean by EU, European. So, in general, those are NA teams. They're NA orgs, and the players who play for them are generally NA. Okay, those ones possibly should be involved with Overwatch League. But even then, a lot of them have had big issues or haven't competed enough internationally, or when they haven't done well enough. Therefore, okay, is it just how much money the org's got that's going to get one of these teams into the league? Like if Cloud9 and NRG pay enough money, do they get their current team into the league over some really good Korean team that either their org can't bid, or someone gets a slot and he decides, I'd rather have this Cloud9 team and market these players than the Korean players who are much better? Does that happen? That's a question, right? Then we've got to look at some of the other ones. So we've got NA orgs that, as far as I know, are actually NA in terms of the ownership, but are EU teams. So Envious hasn't been NA for a long time. That's an EU set of players, but it's an NA org. Astro comes from Charlotte, as far as I know. Then we've got Rogue, the one that's in some way there's ownership stake with that Steve Aoki fucker who does like EDM or something. Now, that's an all-French lineup. So are they EU? Are they NA? Should he be bidding for the Paris slot with French players? Or should he be buying a slot closer to where he is in America? All sorts of questions here that I doubt Steve Aoki and whoever the fuck runs Rogue knows. Then you've got to consider, NA probably should have most of the slots. If you're Blizzard and you're Western and you're speaking English primarily, because in the Western world, NA currently has more money than Europe. Now, it's different in CSGO, admittedly, but in most of the other games, League of Legends especially, the viewership and the money, it's in NA. And so there's a lot of orgs that potentially will import, as they have done in those other games. But two problems with that. One, there's massive amounts of money in Asia that isn't in games like CSGO, and that doesn't have any impact on markets like NA in Europe, in LCS, League of Legends, but that's because they almost can't, because they'd have to have their spot there and they'd have to stay there, so they don't bother spending their money outside of their boundaries. But they have more money in China than they do in EU LCS and arguably NA LCS. So if it's Overwatch League and it's a global league, do those companies come and get involved, and suddenly we find out actually all these Chinese billionaires have bought all the NA slots, and you thought Rogue was getting involved and you thought Envious was getting involved, but you know what, they didn't have 10 million to buy a slot, let's say, if that's indeed what these Chinese orgs could pay, and we know some of them probably could when you hear about the buyouts in Chinese league. So if there's NA orgs, will they just import? In which case, does the importing in any way actually fuck with the whole geolocation aspects? It's a real question to ask, right? Now let's go over to Europe. So let's imagine Europe did have 2 or 3 slots. At the moment, purely EU orgs, there's only a couple that you'd even want to be in Overwatch League as it stands in terms of how good their teams are. It's probably Fnatic, mainly EU, and NIP, Finnish, but EU nonetheless, being as Russia didn't win that war. So these 2 teams, yeah, you'd probably want them in some way to be involved in Overwatch League. Can these orgs afford to buy teams? Have they got this? I mean, as far as I can tell, NIP's had some money issues a couple of years ago. Fnatic's had money issues last year, and we're in a scenario where, in theory, they could have been owned by one of the guys who's an investor in G2 if things had gone badly with a loan that they took. Who says these people can buy out? So are people from outside going to buy slots? Football teams going to buy slots here? And do they have to stay in EU? And will someone who's a football team in Germany buy a slot in Paris if that's all that's available? If so, how does it make sense to their business model? How does it make sense to the bigger business model? Then we got to go and we got to look at the fact that in EU, there might be other teams that are as good as some of those NA teams that have the sponsorship, but that team already has the exposure. Now, you might say, oh, boo-hoo, the NA team's got the exposure. You haven't proven you're good enough. Well, by that logic, Korean teams have proven they're better than most of the Western teams. So maybe they should have the slots instead, and the Western slot owners should buy the Korean teams, because this is a problem. But before we get to Korea, because I'll leave that till the end, because they're the biggest, most important region, China. Now, everyone's going to skip over China because everyone's from EU or NA and everyone knows about Korea being really good. So everyone's going to skip over China and say, no problem there. That's because China, so far, hasn't shown us they have world-class teams. They had some okay teams when they had that APEC tournament, and some of them seemed decent at times, but otherwise none of them seemed legitimately world-class. None of them seemed like they could even necessarily match up with the NRGs of the world, who weren't exactly setting the world ablaze anyway, offline. So no one really knows yet if there's any good Chinese Overwatch teams. But the problem with that is China has fuck tons of money, arguably more money than any other region on an endemic level, where the money they've already got in their esports scene is perhaps more than any other region. Not only that, China has shown themselves to be fairly isolationist. They have already announced their own circuit. They have these 3 tournaments. The Overwatch Premier Series, it's called. There's one in spring that goes April to June. There's one in summer that goes July to October, so that would span over the Overwatch League. And there's one that's the Grand Finals in October. And these leagues, each season is like 150k, 200k, whatever, prize pool in terms overall. And then they've got the big finals. And presumably you have to play them to qualify for the finals. So does that mean the Chinese teams will all just compete there? If only 1 or 2 Chinese teams become part of Overwatch League, will everyone else in China just compete here? And we'll have this little dark area on the map where we're not sure as outsiders what's going on. We're not sure how good they are because they don't compete against Overwatch League teams that we know, but they might be the best for all we know. And maybe they develop past us in the meta. Then we have international play afterwards and they smash everyone. And we're like, oh, we want to play these teams. Sorry, you can't, only in the open circuit time. Is that what's going to happen? Then you've got to consider. So they had APAC Premier already last year. Now they have another APAC tournament announced. It's for November and December. Another big one there. The Chinese esports market is huge. Now, famously, one of the reasons it's huge is they have a huge streaming market there. So the streaming market pumps money into Dota 2 and into League of Legends. That's why you have big salaries, superstar players driving fucking Lambos with all sorts of like super expensive watches and shirts. And you also have people who are sons of rich people or rich people themselves who've gotten involved in orgs. And so you have some huge organizations in Chinese esports that if they could be involved in Overwatch could bring a lot of money, but will they be involved, and will they be involved in the Overwatch League? And especially, will they be involved in the Overwatch League if it's not just for their city, if it's not just for their region, if they have to compete internationally and maybe only compete internationally in the Overwatch League, which let's say it's not in China overall. So they have orgs like Vici Gaming, Edward Gaming, OMG, oh my god, Team World Elite, Team WE, Newbie, Invictus Gaming. These are huge orgs over the past few years of esports, and orgs that have had millions and done transfers for millions, had salaries for millions, bought Koreans, when the Korean esports scene, which historically has had loads of money in it, couldn't even afford to pay the same as these Chinese orgs with their streaming money, with their billions invested in them, were able to provide. Now let's go over to Korea. Because, by the way, if China isn't involved at all, that's a massive amount of money missing there. And that's money that will go into other esports games, not Overwatch. And might even develop their own scene counter to what's going on in the Overwatch League. Now let's go to Korea. Now here is the problem. We are already at the position that people feared from Korea, from seeing League of Legends, from seeing StarCraft 2, from seeing these games where Korea goes ham on them, which is that even without the Kesper teams, which would in theory only professionalize esports bigger there and make the league even more competitive and develop more talent and bring in more coaching structure to it, even without Kesper, at the moment, the best teams in the world are all Korean. Like you've got Lunatic-Hai, arguably a lot of people are picking them to be the best team in the world right now. You've got LW Blue, have some of the most skilled players in the world, might still yet win Apex. You have Runaway, this shocking team to essentially come out of nowhere with all these roster changes and be fantastic and win their group. Top 4 already. You have Meta Athena, another rookie team. This one, even more of a rookie team, coming absolutely out of nowhere from the challenger scene, essentially, dominating that, coming in, and now they've also won their group. They're out already. They're semifinals. They're top 4. Then you have Kongdu Panthera, a bunch of strong players, a bunch of players with tenure in the league, a team that has their own style, absolutely very good still. Then we have Kongdu Uncia, the sister team. Arguably, you could say they've got a better team play approach, but you put them against some of the Western teams, yeah, they might not have gone deep in Apex. They'd brutalize some Western teams. They'd do very well against some of these Western teams, especially Western teams who don't know the meta as it is in Korea right now, or at least how it is on the patch that they're playing on at the moment. So the problem is, I've just listed off, let's see, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I had 6 teams there that arguably could be better than all Western teams. Now, maybe you can make a case, you know what, maybe Envious, maybe Misfits, maybe Rogue, if we got to see them offline. Maybe those teams are as good or better than the bottom ones of those. Maybe they're better than Kongdu Uncia. Maybe they could contend with Panthera. Maybe if they played against Runaway, they'd actually be as good as Runaway. No one really knows, but at the moment, the LAN results say these Korean teams, they already are at that status, and someone's got to come and play them and prove that's not the case. So the problem is, with 6 teams that might be the top 6 in the world in Korea, if the Overwatch League really did end up just having one that was tied to Seoul, it'd be a joke. First of all, there's no way to know which one it should be. If I'm an org and I bought a slot in Seoul, I wouldn't know which one of these teams to pick right now. It could go 3 different ways, could go 4 different ways and end up being right or totally wrong. Not only that, if I pick the wrong team, does that mean what is actually ends up being the best team in the world doesn't compete in Overwatch League? Because at the moment, Overwatch League, by all rights, should have at least 3 or 4 of these 6 teams if it's going to be a competitively respected league that has kind of the integrity of being the biggest league and the high-profile league, but also having the best teams. So as a result, the question then becomes, if NA has most of the slots, which seems reasonably likely, do NA orgs get the slot and then just buy Korean teams? Now, I don't have a problem with that. I'd like that to happen because I want to see these top Korean teams play. But if that happens, do these teams, except for whoever gets the Seoul slot, all vacate Korea and go to America and live there? Do they stay in Seoul even though they represent, like Washington or whatever, or Seattle? Do they just stay in Seoul even though they represent that team? That seems to have its own flaws to the geolocation element, right? Then you've got to consider, what if the Kesper teams, that's what they've been waiting for. What if with all their money, they're waiting to see how Overwatch does, and one of them comes in, SK Telecom, and they say, right, we'll buy the slot for 2 million. In theory, SK Telecom just paid a few million to Faker, the best player in League of Legends, to stay in their big team. They've won Worlds a few times. So let's say SK Telecom comes in and they buy the Seoul slot. Right, what happens to all the other Kesper teams? So what happens to teams like KT Rolster, another very storied team, tons of championships in many games, presumably good finances. CJ enters. CJ's parent company is a massive company in Korea. Then you've got to have Samsung, literally Samsung supporting that organization. Admittedly, haven't been willing to invest in esports as much, but what a backer, right? Got Jin Air, obviously literally an airline supporting them. So there's a lot of people here who wouldn't be involved. I mean, I've already listed off, how many was that? 5 different names there. But we've only got 1 slot for Seoul, likely, and you've got all these people who could be interested. Now, there's a problem in itself. The country, the geolocation approach almost doesn't work for Korea. Because in Korea, Seoul has 1/5 of South Korea's population. It has around 10 million people, and there's around 50 million people live in South Korea. So having other cities in Korea doesn't make a lot of sense. Like maybe you could have Busan, as we say it in the West. You could have that one. You could have a couple more. But would it make sense to have 5 geolocations in Korea? Probably not, especially since all the teams live in Seoul. And yet, if you don't have 5, will there be 4 or 5 Korean teams in Overwatch League? That's the problem, right? Because really the problem with this aspect is, if we have half the slots go to the Koreans in Overwatch League and we get all the best teams, they're going to bump out tons of fan favorites and tons of the people that like Westerners might want to cheer for or might care about, because I know how plebbish Westerners can be when it comes to who they support. Then we got to ask this. If you don't get that, if you get all the Western teams you want and a few of the Korean teams and maybe 1 or 2 Chinese teams, right now, doesn't Korea, outside of the teams that go to Overwatch League, just develop in their own little ecosystem and their own little bubble? And we don't see them again until Overwatch League ends and the open circuit comes, and suddenly all these Korean teams come over and smash everyone. And maybe they even smash the Korean teams that are in Overwatch League because they were separated from the pack, as it were. We're just playing in our meta. And over in their little meta over here, it turns out they had the best teams. That would be the way at the moment you'd have to bet it would go, actually. So at the moment, there is no perfect fix, right? You can't placate everyone who wants the best teams and all the best Korean teams and all the Chinese billionaires and placate all the Western esports people who want to get involved in massive sports orgs in the West, and at the same time have those orgs have potentially the best teams, so let them buy teams from other continents, but at the same time somehow represent a city and be located there. And where is the Overwatch League taking place anyway? You see all the problems here. And my big problem, if I was to sum it up, is not with any of those little details there. You can come up with something that goes one way or another on the philosophy for all of those. And maybe you can make it consistent. At the moment, we see no consistency, even in thought of ideas and how an idea might fit together. But let's imagine they could come up with one. Now, we'd have to imagine whoever came up with it would have to have a very nuanced, subtle, in-depth opinion, worldview, understanding on how esports works. And then how to progress esports past where it is now. How to integrate the globe, all esports from different parts of the globe, different cultures, different scenes, different business economies, into one thing, and then make it work in a way that no one has ever done in the history of esports. And the problem is, to assume someone would do that, we have to figure that they must have some qualifications or some history. Like, maybe they've worked in esports for many years, or maybe they have history working with certain leagues. Maybe they've implemented things. Maybe they come from another world, but they have a good idea for esports, right? We don't know any of this. We have no idea who these people in Blizzard are. What are their guiding principles? What is their philosophy from which they will then construct a system and rules within it and then make sure there's consistency and coherence throughout their league? At the moment, we have no way to know. And Blizzard doesn't do us any favors. I mean, they're not talking to esports. They're talking to the Sports Business Conference, Sports Business Leaders Conference. That's who they're going out talking to and giving ideas about this stuff to, or even showing examples to. Do they talk to the esports world? Do they do interviews? Do they have teams that they've gone and talked to privately? If so, that's all NDA'd. We never find out. We don't get any clues. We just know Overwatch League starts in Q3, quarter 3, and could have any of these teams, could have any of these locations, could take place anywhere, could be in one location, could take place all over the world, could have all the good teams, could have barely any of the good teams, could have all the popular names, could have barely any of the popular names, could have all the money of Asia, Korea and China, could have none of the money of Asia. They could be their own ecosystems, could just be a Western league with a few imports. No one knows right now.